Hello, my name is Dr. Francis Ferre. I'm the director of the Inflammatory Bowel Disease Center at Boston Medical Center and a professor of medicine at the Boston University School of Medicine. Thank you for joining us today for best practices for electronic health record documentation to overcome barriers to prior authorization for patients with inflammatory bowel disease. This is the second module in the three-part series designed to provide you with some of the best practice strategies that you can use to improve your success rates for prior authorization and to minimize the impact of prior authorization on staff administrative time, clinical workflow, and patient care. If you haven't viewed Part 1, I encourage you to check it out. It gave some great strategies for easing the burden of prior authorizations on your daily workflow. In Part 3, we'll address denials and discuss strategies for the appeals process with the mindset that no doesn't necessarily mean no. Knowing that the activities will generate questions, we've created that platform so that you can submit your questions to us by completing the adjacent form. Responses to questions will be posted on the digital hub at cmeoutfitters.com as part of a library of toolkits, templates, tracking spreadsheets, appeal templates, and patient educational videos that can be used in your practice, and resources to share and use with your team involved with the prior authorization process. Also, for those who complete the full series, CME Outfitters will award a Certificate of Excellence in Prior Authorization. With me today are my colleagues, Michelle Rubin from the University of Chicago and Tony Zohorian from Boston Medical Center. Michelle is an advanced practice nurse and associate director of the Inflammatory Bowel Disease Center and director of advanced practice nursing at the University of Chicago. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you.
Dr. Tony Zohorian is a clinical pharmacy specialist at the Center for Digestive Disorders at Boston Medical Center and works with me on a regular basis on these issues. Welcome to the program, Tony.
Thank you.
In this second module, we are going to be focusing on improving processes, documenting disease activity, and data that supports the use of biologics. Our learning objective is to implement a prior authorization protocol to improve documentation in the electronic health record and minimize barriers to medication approval. Prior authorization is not only an administrative burden, but it's a burden that can have severe consequences for our patients with inflammatory bowel disease. As you can see on this slide, there are requirements that step therapy that require patients to fail several therapies before gaining coverage for your prescribed treatment. Payer protocols can have dire effects on patient care and the personal and professional functioning and their quality of life. Variation in payer requirements and criteria can be a barrier to approval. Michelle, one of our struggles with prior authorization is that we often don't see eye to eye with the payer about what the appropriate initial medication to use. Is there data that support biologic therapy earlier in the course of disease for our patients with moderate to severely active ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease?
Yes, Frank. There have been multiple studies. This particular study right here looked at Crohn's disease, and it demonstrated to us that the patients with moderate to severe disease require the use of biologics initially, instead of the traditional approach where we started out with medications, not the biologics, but the mesalamines or different steroids and things initially, get them in remission. But those patients often that had the severe to the moderate disease really needed to start out with biologics earlier. And in the beginning, we were sort of making them earn the use for us to provide biologics for them.
Thank you very much for clarifying that for us, Michelle. I guess the next step, though, is to identify who has moderate to severely active Crohn's disease. And I know that the AGA clinical care pathways helped us. Can you review those for us?
Yes, this one here is the pathway for Crohn's disease. And as you see, on the left is low risk and on the right is high risk. And in the middle there, you see the patient characteristics that qualify them as either low risk or high risk. In the next slide, this is the pathway for ulcerative colitis, characterizing colectomy risk. And again, you see the parameters there, and the provider can then differentiate low risk or high risk for their patients. Now, these pathways are all evidence-based, and the expert GI IBD clinicians were involved in setting up this pathway.
Thank you again for helping us identify patients who have high-risk characteristics of both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, because this is the group that potentially is likely to benefit from early use of a biologic. Tony, the AGA has developed clinical care pathways that we just discussed for both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, and they were developed to help us guide treatment and decision-making. Can you talk a little bit about the pathways and why they are important?
Certainly. As you mentioned, I do think these pathways help to guide your treatment decisions. This first slide reviews initial treatment for patients who are considered high-risk Crohn's disease patients. And as you can see, there are several treatment options available that are supported by the AGA when you are treating your patients in clinic. This slide reviews the AGA care pathway for ulcerative colitis, specifically in those patients who are considered high risk. On the left hand of the slide, you have the induction therapy options, and on the right hand of the slide, you have the maintenance therapy options. So these will also be useful for your care team as you are developing and filling out your prior authorization forms.
Thank you, Tony. The AGA pathways provide clear guidance to us as clinicians as to which drug to choose in our patients with moderately severely active ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. Do the payer policies actually typically follow the same path?
Unfortunately, no. It would make life much easier if they did, but unfortunately most of them do not follow the AGA care pathways. This slide presents data on a review of 50 payer policies, a majority of which you can see did not follow the AGA care pathways. Many of these policies also require that patients will fail 2 or more anti-TNF therapies before approving another biologic, vedolizumab.
Michelle, we always talk about setting ourselves up for success in this program. That begins with good documentation of the patient's disease activity in their electronic medical record. So now let's talk specifics. What should be in the chart and easily retrievable to make a good prior authorization case?
So first of all, you need to create a template for the electronic health record that includes, number 1, your year of diagnosis for the patient with the ICD-10 code, and a detailed disease course. You really want to paint a good picture of this patient's clinical phases. You need to include colonoscopy, radiographic, and imaging results, type of disease and area that is involved, and that's what you're going to get with the results of these examinations. You want to be sure you have the extent of disease documented. You want to document the pertinent lab results and imaging in one location of the notes, particularly your C-reactive protein, fecal calprotectin, which are inflammatory markers of inflammation, and also hepatitis B and TB testing, because these are also pertinent tests to have prior to starting biologics. The history of flares is very important. It needs to be understood if there are repeated flares and the medications are not working. As we said, all prior medication and failures in one section of the note. This is where a good templated note of clinical documentation is very important for the providers to have, so that the persons who are doing the prior auths have this information right there for them, and they can submit your note. And it's also very important to summarize the clinical need for new medication in the same place and include the reasoning for avoiding preferred options.
I would reinforce what Michelle just said. I think this is the first step in getting a particular drug approved. If you do not have a clear-cut picture of what the patient has been through, what they failed, and what their status is, you're less likely to be able to overcome a denial from an insurance company. So getting it right the first time, which we've said multiple times, often is the best way to get to the solution that you're trying to get to. So let's say you've submitted the prior authorization. How often do you or someone in your office have to talk to someone at the insurance company?
Well, fairly often if the initial prior auth did not have all the appropriate information in it to justify the need for the medication. So it can occur, often, or even if there were mistakes in your first documentation that you sent in. So if a policy requires a step failure therapy of agents, we consider requesting a peer-to-peer to call to review the policy and request a standard care review. It's very important that you have the chart and the information that you supplied in your prior auth in front of you so that you have the information there that they need and require. If a peer-to-peer is required or desired, you want to request the same specialty-specific peer reviewer.
Yes, I agree with that. Whenever we do request a peer-to-peer, we always specifically ask to speak to a gastroenterologist who potentially has the insight and understands the nuances of why we're requesting a particular medication. Tony, outside the information in the chart itself, are there any other things that we should include when submitting a prior authorization that may make the case for a particular agent?
Certainly, I think it's important to provide evidence to support your argument, particularly if you've researched the insurance criteria and you know that there are certain steps you're hoping to skip. It's important to provide the reasoning for why you would like to do that. And oftentimes that does come through clinical trials or literature that's available online, or things even that you've seen at presentations in different conferences. You can also include the AGA care pathways. Honestly, prior authorizations can sometimes be many pages long if you are providing enough support for your argument. It is also important to provide information supporting drug-specific therapy, including mechanism of action, and again, data supporting use of potentially a patient who has not tried an anti-TNF and we're jumping to another biologic first. Really support your argument all the time.
Thank you, Tony. I think this is a key point in that we should be including the clinical care pathways, results from therapeutic drug monitoring, all the things that would make a cogent case for the reviewer to understand what we were asking for. I'd like Michelle and Tony now to wrap up this particular part 2 of our program discussing SMART goals in creating prior authorizations and getting our patients the appropriate therapies that they need.
So first off, create a process and a template in the electronic health record of essential information regarding the patient's disease that's going to support the medical need for the use of the biologic. You're going to want the year of diagnosis, the ICD-10 code, and a detailed course of their flares, et cetera, that they've been having. All the imaging, colonoscopy, radiographic evidence is very key. Any pertinent lab results, as we said previously, that are inflammatory markers possibly, as well as what are the TB and hepatitis B that need to be given to a patient prior to any start of biologics. History of flares, as I said before, and all prior medication failures is also very key. Why are we switching to the biologics, or why are we changing to a different mechanism of biologics?
So that was a good summary of all the subjective and objective information to include, Michelle. I'd also say that it's important to summarize your assessment and plan for the patient, including literature to support that plan that you have developed. In addition, I would say you want to include the AGA care pathways, specifically if this is something that you have decided to follow.
I know this can seem daunting in terms of having to include all this information, but it's in your electronic medical record anyway. So just find a way to consolidate it, because that first submission is the one that's most likely to be approved. And so taking the time to put this in one place, easily reviewable by the person at the insurance company, is more likely to lead us to success on the first go-round. I'd like to thank Michelle and Tony for this very practical discussion and for sharing their insights, experience, and strategies for developing best practices for clinical documentation with an eye on prior authorization. Please visit the Gastroenterology Digital Hub at cmeoutfitters.com, where you'll find all 3 modules, as well as template letters, checklists, spreadsheets to help you build or improve your processes in obtaining prior authorizations. You'll also find a video for patients explaining what they can expect from the processes that you may find helpful. Thank you for joining us today. We sincerely hope that we are able to provide you with the tools to improve your clinical documentation processes, to increase prior authorization success, and most importantly, improve clinical outcomes in your patients with inflammatory bowel disease.